Well, good afternoon and welcome, everyone. It's so good to see so many of you here back from last week. I'm Vicki Richmond Hawkins, the Director of Continuing Education here at UW-Marathon County. And last week we had 230 lifelong learners across the street for 3 days with our Good Ideas program. And I promoted this program there, and so happy to see so many of you that came back because you wanted some more education. We didn't fill you up last week. This afternoon's talk was one of those last minute, just serendipitous things that happened. Many of you know that Elaine Streit has taught classes for me on the Middle East. She's done book discussions and film series, and we've been wanting to continue with that, but Elaine wasn't available to teach class for me. But just before I went to press, about a day or two before I went to the printer with the winter catalog, she emails me and says, there is this gentleman from Simmons College. He's an expert on the Middle East. He teaches there, and he will be in the area because he has family up in Hazelhurst, and he'll be here for the holidays. He has to go back, though, and can we get it in before January 12th? And I said, yes, we'll make it happen. And we squeezed it into the catalog. We were able to get some press, and all of you are here today because of that. So who are these radical Islamists that have taken up all the news here in the West? Are they the people that Donald Trump calls them? Or are they somebody else? Are they maybe the Tunisian students that we have in the residence hall here at UWMC who are doing an international dinner for us? Are they Khadra, my friend on Facebook who was an international student here last year that I have befriended and continue to talk to? Who are these people? That's what we're going to find out this afternoon. Wanted you to have an opportunity to hear from a person who is an expert in the Middle East. Kirk Beattie teaches at Simmons College in Boston. He was a Fulbright scholar this past 2 years in Paris, where he was actually seeing Islamists living and coping in the West firsthand. So he has that knowledge. He's written several books, and he'll be telling you about those. If you saw the article in the paper or heard any of the news releases, you know some of the rest of his background. So rather than my taking any more time, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker today, Dr. Kirk Beattie, and let him tell you on who these radical Islamists in the West are. Kurt, it's yours.
Thank you, Vicki. I have roots to this area that go back to the latter part of the 1980s. My wife is from here, and I owe special thanks to Elaine Streit for inviting me to speak here today. I met her husband, John Visti, when we were both students in a federally funded Arabic language program in Tunis, Tunisia, back in 1975. A few years later, I met Elaine Hess at the time, who subsequently, at the University of Michigan, and I saw her at a number of social functions relating to Middle East matters at the University of Michigan. People went their separate ways. I discovered years later, actually after I came here, having become engaged to my wife, meeting people in the community, that the two of them had met one another and had become married and so forth. And I was thinking, as I've told the story a number of times, but John Visti's father was brought here. I'm sure many of you in the audience maybe even know who he is, was brought here to basically kind of run the company that my wife's grandfather helped to put on its feet, Employers Insurance of Wausau. And so there are all these ironic twists and turns of fate in terms of my connection to this area and to specific people in the area. And I thought that for this occasion, I would, at the beginning, add a little bit of a new twist to the story in saying that if people were prophetic, and I, for example, way back in the late 1970s had approached Elaine and said, Elaine, you're going to meet somebody that I met a few years ago, and you will become married and you will have children. She probably would have slapped me. I'm sure that her husband at the time would have been incredibly upset as well. But I thought, in addition to that if John had come along to me even a few years earlier and said, Kirk, I think I've met your future wife, and she's quite cute. But there's a bit of a problem here, right? And, well, she's also related to the person that brought my father to work in Wausau and so forth. But there's a bit of a problem. It's maybe a little bit early to tell how she's going to. Well, why is that? Well, because she's 9 years old. I was 22 at the time, right? And so I would have thought, well, that's unbelievable. I find that really hard to imagine that will be happening. And he might have tried to reassure me by telling me, well, I think she's about to turn 10 in just a few months. She's older than it sounds when you say that she's 9. Anyway, it's good to be here, and I am a person who specializes in the Middle East primarily, but I teach at a small college in Boston called Simmons College, as you've heard. And at Simmons, I wear more than one hat in terms of areas that I teach about. I've also spent a number of years living in France. In fact, I've sort of been a refugee from the Middle East, living in France more recently because the State Department wouldn't allow me to go to do my Fulbright in Egypt. So I ended up in Paris. And I had lived in France a number of years before there. I speak French reasonably fluently and so forth as well. And so what I want to talk about today really has to do with Islamists in the West, but with more of a focus on France and the French case, so to speak. And I think that, again, a lot of you maybe sitting here right now know much more about what happened earlier in the day-to-day in Istanbul, Turkey, right, where there was yet another ISIS attack. And last I heard there were 10 people who were killed, 9 of whom were Germans. But I think that what I can provide to you, hopefully, is maybe greater depth of knowledge and somewhat breadth of knowledge in terms of the Islamists in Western European countries, to provide you with a better understanding of what kind of conditions, circumstances are helping to produce these individuals. So that's my intention. I'm going to take us back several decades then. I'm going to go back into the 1950s, but I'm going to go over this fairly quickly early on, and talk about the fact that it was in the 1950s, which as a result of the end of the period of imperialist control by various Western European countries of major parts of the world and so forth, including the Middle East and North Africa, and the entry of those countries into this era of decolonization, that consequently you had a large number of people that fled the countries in which they were residing. People in this community in particular can relate to that. It's something that's familiar to you if you have any level of social consciousness in this area at all, because of the presence of the Hmong community here, right? People that sort of face similar circumstances. And so in the 50s and in this era of decolonization, independence for the countries of the area, you have both push and pull factors that were at play. Push in the sense that people who were residing in these countries often had been brought up to think that they should think of themselves as being more French than they were Algerian, for example. They were literally taught this. They knew the geography of France. They knew the history of France. They knew French literature way better than they knew the geography and the history and the literature of the country in which they were growing up. So a lot of Algerians drank the French Kool-Aid and saw themselves in this way. They also went beyond that, and they collaborated very actively with the colonial regime in France. So for them, for many of them, it was a matter of life and death to escape from Algeria during the latter part of the 1950s or in the early 1960s when the Algerian independence movement finally came to full fruition. Because if they were to stay behind, then they could have been tortured and or just shot as a result of their collaboration with the French. This happened in a lot of other places, obviously, as well. I'm just going to pick and choose as I go along here to give people an understanding of what circumstances people were facing, in different parts of this region in this time frame. The pull factors, of course, came and continue to come because, after all, France and other Western European countries were countries that were at a much higher level of economic development. There was much better provision of jobs to people at that time. So economic circumstances were much more propitious in most of the European countries, including France, in this time frame. But also, of course, the people in Western Europe enjoyed a much greater measure of freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of cultural activity, and so on and so forth. And so there's this push-pull phenomenon that explained why large numbers of people left North African countries or Middle Eastern countries, beginning roughly in the mid-1950s, but lasting all the way up until pretty much the end of the era of decolonization, which was in the early 1970s. And a lot of you would be familiar with the sort of major migratory patterns involved in these changes. Hope my computer isn't frozen. I may have to wing it here if I have a problem with that. Don't know what's going on with that. Sorry. Here we go. And so, in terms of major movements of people, you had, if you look at the United Kingdom, for example, people have traveled there, then you know that the people who ended up in the United Kingdom were people who came primarily from places like Pakistan or from India or out of the Caribbean, right? People who were migrating from the broad region that I'm looking at to Germany were people who came primarily from the country of where the incident occurred today, Turkey. As far as France was concerned, then you had a lot of people who came out of principally Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, but also from other Middle Eastern countries, including out of Lebanon and other places. But most of them came out of these different countries of North Africa. Now, the first wave of people to make this migration tended to be younger men. They came by themselves. They lived in cramped quarters with other men. They tried to save money, most of them as best as they could, to ship money back to their families at home. Over time, they could bring spouses or their entire families to join them. The people then of the second generation, and now we have third and fourth generations of people residing in France and numerous other Western European countries, were people who grew up in those countries, who, if you have a country like France where they have what's called jus soli, like we do in the United States, meaning that if you are born in the country, then you automatically acquire the nationality of that country, then these people who were born in France became French citizens from the get-go. And so the second generation, third generation, fourth generation Algerian French are people that have been French citizens. They were brought up through the French school system. They're completely fluent in French as a foreign language, and they make their way around the system and inside the country much more readily and easily than did the first generation of immigrants. But of course, as we'll see, they encountered tremendous difficulties along the way. Jumping ahead to the forward then, to the present day, if we look at sheer numbers, just to give an idea of the magnitude of the emigration and the descendants of the immigrants and so forth, there are roughly 44 million Muslims living in Western European countries today. Just to take a few examples, there are about 6 million Muslims living in France. That's about 10% of the population overall. There are about 2 million Muslims living in the area of Paris, and so that constitutes quite a significant chunk of the number of people who are living in Paris. My wife and I happened to be there at the end of my first leave there in June of 2014, when, if there are any soccer fans and World Cup fans in the audience, the Algerians managed to qualify for the World Cup, which was a huge thing. We had been having dinner not very far away from the Champs-Élysées, the very famous Central Boulevard in Paris, and I said, well, let's go check this out, right? And so we walked over to the Champs-Élysées, arrived at it very near the Arc de Triomphe and so forth, and sure enough, here were all these cars that were coming in from these places to which I'll refer in a little moment. And the number of people there, almost all of whom, I think we were about the only two white people who were there, other than some of the people who were in the police forces who were there to guard different sites and so forth. All the other people, thousands and thousands and thousands of people that were there were people who were quite clearly of North African origin, mostly Algerian French, but sometimes their Tunisian or Moroccan French friends had come along to join them to just join in the festivities and so forth. So the people of these backgrounds sort of owned the Champs-Élysées for that night. It was just a spectacular thing to see. And it must have been kind of empowering, I think, in some ways for the people to have seen that and experienced that themselves. If you look at just a couple of other countries, Belgium is in the news. Why? Because Belgium is the country which has produced, on a per capita basis, more people that have signed up to go to fight alongside ISIS than any of the other European countries have, if you didn't know that. So about 6% of the population in Belgium is from this sort of Muslim background. And also the same figure exactly for the Netherlands, where you have a number of incidents that have occurred relating to Muslims and lots of tension along political lines relating to Islamists. So you can have significant presence of Muslims in a number of different European countries. Germany, as I mentioned beforehand, the UK, those are sort of the more important ones. Sweden, also a significant number of people. Those are the countries that kind of head the list. All right, now what was the problem back in earlier times for these people in terms of integration and assimilation? First of all, they're people that are coming in, they speak a different language primarily. A lot of them would know some French, but they speak French with a very heavy accent. There is no P in the Arabic language. And so the P sound, like for Paris, for Paris, comes out as Bari. They roll their R's too. And so immediately you can hear the accent of people that are coming out of the Middle East because of the way that people who are from there and grew up there speak other languages where there are various sounds that they didn't learn how to pronounce when they were little kids. So you have also obviously the religious difference, the ethnic difference, the difference in physical appearance. But what helped to compound the problem then of people coming from this different sort of other background was that they came in such large numbers that there was a housing problem that was created right away. So the French government recognized that, and they tried to address that situation from about 1956 onward. They actually responded fairly quickly and impressively in terms of sheer numbers. And so you had, by the time you get into the late 1960s and the early 1970s, as many as 300,000 different residential units that were being created on an annual basis. That compares very favorably, if you want to look that up, with the total, if you add these up, with the total number of federally funded housing units in the United States, which is obviously an enormous country by comparison with the different Western European countries that we're looking at. So you have people that are living in these specific residential units that have been created for them. These are called HLM, using the acronym in the French case. And they were designed to appear modern, on the outside at least, and to look kind of spiffy. Le Corbusier, if you know that name, famous architect, had a very heavy impact on the architecture of the day or the decade, so to speak. So they looked pretty nice from the outside, but they were only meant to be rather temporary in terms of they're servicing the needs of the people that are coming from faraway places, including initially people that were coming from inside France, because after the end of the Second World War, there was a lot of internal rural to urban migration by French people. So you had not just people that were coming from North African countries that are living in these units, but you also had other French people that were living in it. It's just that over time what happened was that a lot of the white French people, the Français de souche as they're called, the French people with roots in the country ended up leaving those residential areas fairly soon on. And so, those residential areas acquired far greater ethno-religious homogeneity as time marched on. Now, what you're left with then are these areas that are called the banlieue. we couldn't kind of make this sync up with that easily, so I can't point to anything on the board. But the banlieue is a word that people in France would translate as suburb. But suburb, to any of us here, has a certain connotation in terms of the type of housing that you're likely to find there, and it being a little bit leafier, you know, of neighborhoods, and so on and so forth. Whereas the banlieue, then, that I'm talking about here, really end up being the functional equivalent of what we would refer to as ghettos. And so these are areas on the outskirts of the city, rather than being in the inner city, which have become ghetto-like in their nature. And then inside these different banlieues, you have what the French call cité, C-I-T-E, nice little accent on the E at the end. And the cité, then, is a word which, if you know a little bit more about it, you would immediately translate into what we refer to as the projects. And so you have people living in these projects, in these cités, in the suburban areas, the banlieue of Paris or of other major cities in the area. And they're not only then different from other people in terms of their physical appearance, in terms of their command of the language, in terms of their religion, but now they're isolated in all these different ways too by their places of residence as well. People that are living in these areas and their children then are acquiring also lower levels of education, not as a result of the kind of funding that's being provided by the government itself so much, as because of the quality of education in these areas where the schools are located. They're also having a much harder time finding a job. I'll probably come back and talk about that a little bit later on. But people have done studies and shown that merely by dint of the fact that people were living in those particular areas, they would have a 10 to 20% higher rate of not finding a job than people who were living in other parts of the city of Paris or in other parts of the country. And so we're looking at, people then who are experiencing extremely difficult circumstances. Another thing that makes people from these backgrounds also have such a hard time finding a job is their name. It's something I don't think that most of the people in the room would think about, right? But if you're applying for a job and your name is Mohammed, you're applying for a job and your name is Ahmed, you're applying for a job and your name is Gibril, or pick another name, then immediately the prospective employer can do what? Recognize that person as a person who's a Muslim. And so there have been studies, people have tested the system, so to speak, and discovered that it's very easy for people to be discriminated against strictly on the basis of their name. They can apply for a job, have credentials that are as good as or better than other people that are applying for the same job, but because they happen to have a name like Mona or Ahmed or whatever, then this is a huge strike against them, and they don't end up getting the job. So there are a lot of negative circumstances associated with people coming from these backgrounds to begin with. And what made things all the worse for them over time was, I'm going to employ some very serious social science terms here, sort of a double and triple whammy, or double and triple whammies that occurred not too long after their arrival in the area. Things that affected very deeply the French economy and also affected the economies of many other Western European countries at the time. The first of these came in conjunction with the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. And so at the time of the 1973 war, the major Arab producers of petroleum decided to slap an embargo on all countries that were assisting the enemy, Israel. And this struck primarily the United States, affected the Netherlands to some extent, as well as specific countries. People here in the audience, I certainly was old enough to remember this myself, right? When were the only times in your life, or one of the only times in your life that you had to wait in a line to buy a serious product? Remember lining up to buy the gasoline at the gas stations? So I'm not talking about Cabbage Patch dolls and things like that, right? Or different kinds of games. I'm talking about something quite serious. And this is one of the few times ever in this country in my lifetime that people had to wait in line to purchase goods. If there wasn't this kind of same direct impact on the Western European countries, as a result of their being the ones that were targeted for embargoes as a result of assistance to Israel at that time frame, something even really more dramatic happened as far as most of the Western European countries were concerned, because what happened to the price of the barrel of oil as a result of the 1973 war and the way that this played itself out? If you don't remember, the cost of the barrel of oil quadrupled. And so people that were major importers, as most of the Western European countries were, of petroleum and petroleum products, all of a sudden had to pay 4 times as much for their energy supplies as they did prior to 1974. And I would argue, and a lot of economists would argue, that the welfare state, which had been successfully created in the post-war years, was very, very heavily negatively affected by this quadrupling of oil prices. And in a way, the welfare state maybe has never fully recovered from the impact of the quadrupling of energy prices, or many of the countries in Western Europe have not fully recovered from the impact of the quadrupling of energy supplies as a result of that particular change. The French, for example, talk about the period from 1945-46 all the way up until basically 1974-75 as les 30 glorieuses, by which they mean the 30 glorious years of economic growth and expansion. Well, they came to an end because of the quadrupling of the cost of energy. And so all of the expansion of the welfare state, which had been reasonably easily financed up until that point and covered, which also then provided assistance to people coming from the backgrounds that I'm talking about, had a very, very serious wrench thrown into the works as a result of that particular change. So in just a major, major crisis. The second thing that's of relevance, the second major whammy that I was referring to a moment ago, is the one that was encountered by the time you get into the 1980s. What happened here in the early 1980s as far as production of goods and so forth in factories? Anyone remember that and whether that caused any problems? I grew up north of Detroit. And so I grew up in the area where all kinds of people worked in the automobile factories, right? By the time you get into the early 1980s in the Detroit area, people are starting to think over the ensuing years of, last person to leave Detroit, turn out the lights and stuff like that. Why? Because the nature of production changed so radically in Detroit and in other parts of this country, because people were switching over to the use of more automated production techniques. They were switching over to robotics. That came a little bit later in the French case, but it still came to France and to other Western European countries as well. And so this decreased the demand for workers in factories, which had its own impact then on people who were working, for example, in many of the larger developed and stronger labor unions in a country like France. Often the labor unions had very close ties with the Communist Party or with the Socialist Party and so forth. So all of a sudden these people, their labor services are no longer needed, and to the extent that people are looking for more menial work employees, they're switching to the people who are likely to be least demanding in terms of the wages that they're demanding, and that is people that are members of the immigrant worker population or the descendants of people in the immigrant worker population. In fact, if you look at what happened, I'm going to talk about this momentarily, it's quite interesting because you get into this whole phenomenon across Europe then of where the rise of different right-wing populist parties, as they're referred to. I think you can refer to them also as quasi-fascistic parties. They're extreme right-wing parties that are appearing during this particular time frame, such as, for example, the National Front Party, which was created in 1972 in France and headed by this former parachutist, Jean-Marie Le Pen, whose daughter, Marine Le Pen, has taken over command of the party in more recent years. And so you have these new parties that are starting to crop up, like the Front National or the National Front Party in France. And they're making arguments beginning then in the early 1972, beginning in the early 1970s, in 1972, a couple years before these changes really start to have, or a decade before the second change begins to have its impact, that, well, you know, these immigrant workers are here and they're stealing our jobs. You know, they're stealing the jobs from the white French, and something needs to be done about that. And so you have people like Monsieur Le Pen arguing, against continued permission for people to immigrate to France from various countries, taking a very, very hard line against immigration, things that maybe we hear in this country today, right? And actually using terminology, though, that is very, very harsh. So Le Pen, for example, and harsh in different directions and against different peoples. And so Le Pen, for example, in a national debate, going through the series of people, major candidates, you know, when asked to address this issue, people would be asked, well, okay, well, what do we do then about the issue of the migrant workers and their descendants and so forth? And the people in the Socialist Party would say things like, well, you know, there's a real problem of assimilation here, and so we need to invest more to try to make sure that these people are successfully assimilated and integrated into French society. We need to invest more in their education. And then you'd move to the more conservative, right-wing, but mainstream right-wing political candidate, and they would say things like, well, you know, I think we need to really check the rates of immigration, and maybe we need to close the doors to immigration to a good number of people and so forth. And then they arrived in this one particular debate to Mr. Le Pen himself and posed the same question, you know, what would you do? And he said, I won't bore you with the French, you know, I'll give them 5 minutes. You know, 5 minutes to do what? 5 minutes to pack their bags and to get out of the country. And so that resonated with a fair number of people in the country and across what was at the time the political spectrum. And if you also look at other dimensions often associated with these far right-wing parties, then they're kind of equal opportunity racists, in that there often is an anti-Semitic dimension attacked to their language, their rhetoric, and their diatribes. And so the same Mr. Le Pen, this is something I'll note quickly has been toned down a bit by his daughter, was anti-Semitic. And so Mr. Le Pen, in public one time when asked about the Holocaust, responded, "Why are you bothering me with questions about the Holocaust? You know, ce n'est qu'un petit détail de l'histoire. This is only a small historical detail." Very, very strong, harsh, nasty language, language that resonates with some people in the country, right? With way more people in the country than one might hope that it would resonate with. But it's the one about they're stealing our jobs, I think, is the item that of course resonated most with people in the populations in general. Now, if I step back into the area that I'm more familiar with for a little while, which is that of the Middle East, and I lived in the Middle East when these events were unfolding, these developments in the 70s and on into the early 1980s in Western Europe were coterminous with very, very important changes that were occurring in Middle East and North African countries. Because as a result of the 1967 war loss, which is a real shock to people on the Arab side of the picture, it caused a lot of psychological discombobulation, loss of hope, and so forth. And so by the time you get into the very late 1960s and the early 1970s, some people are beginning to turn to Islam and to a more conservative interpretation of Islam to find solace for the catastrophe that has struck their country in 1967 and for the overall difficult economic circumstances and social circumstances that they're living in places like Egypt or in other countries like Iran. And I mention those two specifically because those are the two countries which led the way in terms of the growth of an Islamist fundamentalist movement or Islamist fundamentalist movements, a return to more conservative Islam with its more conservative values, a return to Islam as a way of trying to provide them with a way to anchor themselves to find something that was genuine in their own historical past that would hopefully provide them with a pathway out of the difficult straits in which they were finding themselves. I was living in Egypt in the early 1980s, and I had my own domino theory about change in the early 1980s in Egypt. I had a university office to report to as a foreign student, and I went to this large office, and there were all these women primarily, one man, but all these women that were otherwise, about 18 of them, that were sitting around a desk in a big U shape. And at the beginning of the year, the academic year, in the fall of 1980, there was one woman who was muhaggaba, which means there was one woman who was dressing in keeping with the Zia al-Islami, or the Islamic dress code. She was the only person conforming to that. Go back a few months later, and there was 3 or 4 women that were dressed that way. Back a few years after that, and 3 or 4 more women that were dressed that way, until finally on my last visit there at the end of the academic year, there was only one woman who wasn't dressed in more conservative dress. So for the women in the audience especially, think of changing from the way that you've been dressing all the time until you were, let's say, 20-some years old, and then all of a sudden you've decided at that age of 20, 21, 22, 23 to dress in a much more conservative fashion, and to consistently dress in a much more conservative fashion. And I went up to the one woman who said that she was not, and asked why she was not dressing in that manner, and she said, inshallah, if Allah wills it, I'm thinking about this, and so maybe I'm going to dress that way. So this is my domino theory of the impact that the spread of Islamist fundamentalism was having on women in the area at the time, that I literally saw this dramatic change in this one office, but it was something that you could magnify on a grander societal scale to see happening in the broader society as well. This is happening in Egypt, it's happening in Iran. In the Iranian case, it helped to lead to, there were a lot of other factors that contributed to this, and other different groups that contributed to the overthrow of the Shah in the January 1979 revolution. And these factors also contributed to the assassination of Anwar Sadat in October of 1981. And then this Islamist fundamentalist movement is spreading to other countries as well. And so, just to talk about a few things, you have the appearance of Hezbollah in Lebanon, right, in the early 1980s. You have the emergence of Hamas at the time of the first Intifada in 1987. By the early 1990s, you have the Islamist fundamentalists so strong in Algeria, a country of great importance to the French, that the FIS, the Front Islamique de Salut, or the Islamic Salvation Front, is poised to win the election in Algeria and come to power through the ballot box. And then you have a strong movement called a Nahda in Tunisia that was powerful at this particular time as well. So it's appearing, across the region, this spread of the Islamist fundamentalist movement. At the same time, you have what's called soft power being projected very successfully by the Iranians as well as by the Saudi Arabian government. Soft power in the sense that not physical power the way that people are sending planes and combat troops and stuff to other areas, but soft power in the way that the United States is seen as a country that has a lot of soft power, because the movies, the television shows that get shown in other parts of the world are things that are maybe fun to watch, and make people think, hey, wouldn't it be great to be living in the United States? The music, that comes out of the United States, all these things are different forms of soft power. Well, what we tend not to think about it is that soft power can be projected by other people and through other means. And so if you are a radical Shiite, somebody like the people who initially set up the regime in Iran, and many of whom are still in power in Iran today, then you can use your soft power influence and promote your ideas of radical Shiite Islam to help to promote the development of these different parties in other places like in Lebanon and in Syria and in Iraq. If you're a Saudi, of course, you're on the receiving end of now these massive revenues from your oil sales. And so what are you going to do with all that money? You don't really have the manpower. Bad argument to make, I guess, in light of Israel in the area as well and what it manages to do with its smaller manpower. to develop, I was going to say, a really large military force. But, all the better maybe to think of investing your money in the production of cassette tapes in the earlier times, or, different forms of social media today, to try to spread the really ultra-conservative form of Sunni Islamic thinking, the Wahhabi and Salafi kind of doctrine of Islam, interpretation of Islam that undergirds the Saudi system. And so they're literally funding the creation of mosques, not only all across the Middle East and North Africa, but in other parts of the world, in developing countries, and also funding the development of cultural centers and the creation of mosques in Western European countries and in the United States. Things that just didn't exist. And what's taught then at the different cultural centers and mosques is often this more ultra-conservative interpretation of Islam, which is the type of interpretation that is propagated inside Saudi Arabia itself. I'm going to skip over. I don't want to, I don't want people to confuse things here too much. I think I will say one thing in particular about these groups. You don't want to throw them all into the same basket. And so if you hear about Hamas and you hear about Hezbollah, there are some people that would argue, they're all alike, right? It's not accurate to say that they're all alike. So I'll just give one example relating to that. When September 11th happened, the leaders of Hezbollah openly, explicitly condemned the events of September 11th. They just didn't think that this was proper at all for innocent civilians in a faraway country, the United States, despite all of the warts that the United States has as a country, to be attacked in that particular fashion. So I'll leave you with that one note, and we could come back and talk about that a little bit more later on. Now, don't try to take us back into the French case. And there was spillover then from these various developments in France. And this happened in the early 1990s. Why? Because I said before that FIS, this Islamist movement, a more moderate style Islamist movement, was poised to take over via the ballot box in Algeria. The Algerians were holding elections on a two-ballot basis. People go to the polls, like they do in France actually, go to the polls one Sunday, and then you wait a week or two, and you go back to the polls a second Sunday to vote another time, because usually there are so many candidates from so many different parties the first time that it's not really easy to establish who would have the most popular support unless you have a second vote and you thin out the number of people to present just two candidates on a second ballot. What happened in the Algerian case was that everybody could clearly see that the Islamist fundamentalists were going to get elected to power via democratic elections. But the French government decided this could be catastrophic for us. And so they provided active support to the making of a coup, a military coup in Algeria, which blocked the holding of the second stage of elections and kept what had been the existing authoritarian government in power for a good number of years after this 1991 coup. So here's France, beacon of democracy, bastion of liberal democracy, nixing liberal democratic elections held in a developing country, because they're scared as hell that if you had a successful transition in power there, that a lot of the people living in Algeria were going to bail. They're going to want to get out of the country, and where are they going to go, first and foremost? A lot of them are going to try to get on a ship and go across and take up residence somewhere in France, where a fair number of them maybe already have residents, friends and relatives that are in residence. So the United States, by the way, at the time also, in a kind of softer way, also approved of the military coup in the Algerian case, if you were not aware of that happening. So yet another country, liberal democracy, right? Well, maybe not in this case. Maybe that would not be such a good thing. With all of the implications of that and reactions that was likely to get in terms of people, crying hypocrisy as far as the positions of the French and the American governments were involved. So you already have people in France very concerned the antennae are up. They're alarmed by the possibility for significant change relating to the development of the Islamist fundamentalist movement, what consequences that might have inside their own country as a result of what was happening in Algeria. And of course you have all the Algerian French who are watching this too and scratching their heads or swearing, because of the position that was taken by the French government during those elections. It was just slightly before the holding of those elections that the Headscarf Controversy began in France. This is, I think, one which leaves a lot of us scratching our heads, because what occurred was that in one smaller town, a few young girls went off to school, and they had decided to wear headscarves. They had decided to cover themselves. They went muhaggaba off to school. And the people in the local school said, no way, we're not going to allow this to happen here. This shows people very clearly what your religious background is. It's a clear violation of the French principle of a Republican French principle, small r, Republican French principle of what's called laïcité or secularism within the French system, and we're not going to tolerate this. And so they sent the girls home, right? This became a big court case that went all the way up to what's called the Conseil d'État, one of the highest courts you can find in France, which actually ruled initially in favor of these girls wearing the headscarves to school, so they were allowed back in. But this didn't put an end to the debate. Politicians started to latch onto this, and not just the politicians like Mr. Le Pen I was talking about later on, but even other people within the French body politic. A very well-known French politician who was the Minister of Education by 1994 was saying, maybe there's a real problem here and that we can't allow this happening because it is too much of an assault on the Republican principles of laïcité, and maybe we should not be allowing these girls or other people to be wearing these religious symbols. And so they started talking about trying to block this form of behavior, and then it wasn't until maybe the spectacularly surprising, successful performance of Mr. Le Pen in the 2002 presidential elections, when he actually made it into the second round as this far right-wing candidate, a slot typically held either by the conservative French party or a Socialist Party member, to be in the runoff for the presidency in France. Le Pen bested the Socialist Party candidate. That people started thinking about maybe getting more aggressive about some of these issues. And so President Chirac, if you remember him, became involved in recommending that a committee be established to look at the headscarf issue. And there was a committee that was formed, which in December of 2003 had argued, well, we need to ban the wearing of ostentatious religious symbols, because they could be seen as acts of proselytism. We can allow schools perhaps to observe not just Christian holidays, which they probably shouldn't have been doing in the first place at all, but did in their own ways, however subtle or not, but to allow them maybe to observe major Jewish and Muslim holidays. But we should definitely bar kids from missing classes on religious grounds without express written consent from a doctor. When these kinds of issues then finally were brought to the National Assembly, the equivalent of our House of Representatives, the bill that was presented passed by a vote of 494 to 36. That these, so I don't know. Can we imagine that happening here? That people vote to ban the way that girls are dressing themselves, or that young women are dressing to go to school, to high school, to lower grade schools, or to university, and so forth. Interesting question, I suppose, to pose in the situation that we're living in here. Just a few years after that, the law was actually even expanded to put a ban on the hijab, the head covering, wearing of the head covering, to anyone who was delivering public services. So this is not just in the schools now. This is anybody who's doing anything that's government related at all cannot be dressing in a particular manner. I had something, I'm looking at the clock here. I want to save some time for talking. I've got some notes about Germany. I'll just maybe make a couple of quick comments to give you some information from a different case. Germany, of course, in the early 1990s went through this incredible change, right? 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. By 1991, the two Germanys have been reunited. I asked in this time frame a professor from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University how many of the East German factories he thought were good enough, productive enough, that they would continue on after the reunification of the two countries, West and East Germany. He thought for about 20 seconds, and he said, none. Zero. In this city called Rostock, in the northern part of Germany, it was the largest port of East Germany, and it was also a major, major industrial center. So in this area of East Germany, all of a sudden, think of how many people over time were laid off because these factories that were seen as worthless by people in the West, beginning with West Germany, started to close up and fire people. So it was in Rostock in the early 1990s that you started to have very, very ugly incidents occurring, usually by skinheads, and they took to attacking various asylum seekers' residences. And in some cases that occurred in Rostock itself, you had large numbers of people, including police, that stood by and watched as the skinheads threw Molotov cocktails at buildings in which migrant workers were residing. Now, the connection I want to make here quickly about that, because I'm not going to spend as much time talking about the German case, is that it was roughly in this time frame, also in the early 1990s, within a few years of this, that you had people showing up to live in Germany who were coming out of the Middle East, like a Mohammed Atta from Egypt. Anyone out there remember Mohammed Atta's name? Who was Mohammed Atta? Mohammed Atta was one of the pilots, right? And the parents of Mohammed Atta asked him, well, so how did this happen? Well, I don't know. We don't even recognize our son any longer. That was their response. We don't understand this. And because anybody like Mohammed Atta, to have made his or her way to a place like Germany in this time frame, was licking his or her chops. If any of you have lived, in Middle Eastern, North African countries, this is probably true in a lot of other parts of the world as well. If you go by the embassy of the United States, if you go by the British embassy, the French embassy, the Canadian embassy, the Australian embassy, any morning, any workday morning of the week, do you know what you see? Elaine? You see long lines of people, long lines of people. You see long lines of young people waiting to get in the hope, which is very slim for a lot of them, of getting a visa to be able to go to the United States, Canada, France, wherever. Because if they can do that and they can get to these places and they can make it happen and they can succeed in the educational system or whatever there, then Alhamdulillah, may Allah be praised, because life is going to be a whole hell of a lot better for me than it was being stuck behind in a place like Egypt or Algeria or Tunisia or Morocco or whatever. So how do you take a person like a Mohammed Atta and turn him into a person who is piloting one of the planes on September 11th, right? So what did he see and experience? How was he re-socialized once he arrived in Germany? What caused him to change or flip the way that he did? And the only answer that I can come up with that makes any sense is that he experienced such ugly things that were being perpetrated against the Turks, and actually in some of these cases people from Southeast Asia as well, that it caused him to be outraged by what he was seeing there and thinking that he hadn't landed in some more sophisticated, more marvelous place, right? That it was really quite a cruel place that he found himself living in. and that maybe something radical needed to be done to address that situation. Now, by no means am I going on to want to suggest that there's anything good about what, I know it's all abhorrent, despicable behavior. But what causes the people to flip in this way in the first place? You have to try to crawl into their own heads and see what they lived through, that caused them to end up doing what they have ended up doing on September 11th, or what some people, have done on so many other occasions that we can talk about, right? So all of these issues and their politicization, whether they're politicized within countries or they're politicized on an international level, these are factors that people have to take, I think, into very, very serious consideration when you're figuring out what it is that's motivating them and where they're coming from, why they're as angry as they are. September 11th was something that was more perpetrated by then so-called outsiders, if you go back to the comment I made at the very beginning of my talk. Outsiders in the sense that Mohammed Atta didn't grow up in Germany, right? And neither did the other people, the Lebanese guy and the Yemenis and so forth that were involved as pilots as well. Most of the muscle were people that were from Saudi Arabia, right? The 20th person, of course, was from a little bit closer to here in terms of where his experience was, because this is a person who's still in prison. I'm not sure which one exactly, but his last name was Moussaoui, and he was the one who was engaged in flight training, as in how do you learn how to fly a plane, and does anyone remember where he was doing that? He was in the Twin Cities, right? Not that far away. The other people were in Florida, so he was in the Twin Cities. And then people started to think, well, this is a little bit curious because, he's going through this training and he doesn't want to learn how to land or take off, And so people started thinking, this looks a little odd somehow. And so they pointed him out to people, and they picked him out in this way and were able to block him from doing what probably he was intent on doing. We have all of these events that occurred, many of which were in the early to mid-2000s, right? So I guess I won't take the time to slow down too much to go down through the whole list, but a lot of these were perpetrated by insiders. And so that's part of the reason why I chose to focus more on the insiders. May of 2002, Pim Fortuyn, the gay politician, ardently, vehemently, sort of ugly in his anti-Islamic rhetoric, who was killed in Holland. This was by somebody who was more local, but who was responding to what he was saying because he was just so outrageous in his public declarations. When you get into other incidents that you'll recall, I'll just go down through the list quickly. March of 2004, the Madrid train bombing, right? These were Moroccans, Syrian, and Algerians. Those were outsiders. November of 2004, Theo van Gogh, right? The nephew of Van Gogh, killed by a Dutch-born Moroccan. July of 2005, what the Brits call 7/7. We have 9/11, the Brits have 7/7. 7 and 7 is when the bombs were set off in the British underground system. That was undertaken by 3 Pakistanis born and raised in the UK, assisted by a Jamaican raised basically in the UK who had converted to Islam. All of the Pakistanis were Muslims. September of 2005, the Jyllands-Posten cartoons, remember that, in Denmark, with the backlash to that, with the boycotts of Danish products all around the world that resulted from the publication of the nasty depictions of the Prophet Muhammad in that particular publication. Jumping ahead a bit, 2015, just to hit on the bigger events, Charlie Hebdo in Paris, the Kouachi brothers, Algerians born to Algerian immigrants, raised though in France, they're citizens of France. Also January 2015, the kosher supermarket incident by Ahmed Koulibaly, born in France with Muslim roots in Mali and so forth, right? November of 2015, Bataclan, much more recent, obviously, with Belgian and French citizens who were, again, insiders who were involved in those people of Arab backgrounds. So all of these things are very interesting incidents involving people from insider backgrounds for the most part. I just want to make a few comments about these people in terms of how they're perceived by other Muslims before I start to wrap things up. And that is that these people are not seen as good Muslims. They're seen as offbeat, weird, unattractive people in terms of their politics. I had reason to go by what's called Langzhou, the special school that trains people in Paris to learn Arabic and other languages. And I talked to the Arabic language instructors there who are from Egypt. And so they have some of these types of people that are coming there to learn Arabic, right? And so they'll get them into these conversations, or these students will just start talking about Islam and their perception of Islam to these women professors who are Muslims from Egypt. And they look back at them and say, where did you hear this stuff? This has nothing to do with the Islam that we know as people that grew up and lived in. This is crazy talk that you're sharing with us. And so they're getting it off of the internet, right? There's an excellent book I would recommend by a British author called Andrew Hussey, called The French Intifada. And he talks about the mix of sales of drugs and so forth by people who are involved in the radical Islamist movement in France. If you're a good Muslim, you're not taking drugs and you're not drinking for sure, but you're not doing anything that's messing with your head in any serious way. It's bad. It's haram. It's forbidden. You shouldn't be doing that. These people are, taking drugs and themselves and selling them, and at the same time, kind of playing radical Muslim. I read this very recently. There's his name's kind of a weird name actually. That this Abaoud, right? I think they haven't found him yet. Correct? That was involved with the Bataclan incident. He's still missing. And so people know, though, that he was traveling back and forth between Molenbeek and one of these banlieue type places in Belgium to Paris, and he and the other person in the car were smoking joints back and forth on these trips. They were stopped 3 times by a combination of French and Belgian authorities. And they would roll down the windows, and there's the smell of pot or hash or whatever it was they were smoking coming out of the car, to the point that the officers noted this right away. And so they're like, oh boy, we're going to get hauled in now for illegal substances and so forth. But they just let them go because no, we're not looking for that right now, because they were looking for the perpetrators. Well, they were the perpetrators, but they didn't get it. They didn't see the connection there. And then the last one along these lines I'll share with you was with the Ahmed Koulibaly, who was the Malian guy. And he's does drugs himself. But I thought this was particularly interesting to have discovered. His sister, who grew up in the exact same circumstances, almost the exact same age as this guy is, who's this radical Muslim, right? His sister was on France's equivalent of what are the American shows called? With the talent things, America's Got Talent or whatever they're called. I don't watch them, so pardon me. I don't know the exact name of the show. And so his sister was on the French equivalent of that kind of a show on 2 occasions, and what she did as her talent was she was a dancer, and she made tapes, and her thing that she does is twerking, right? So she's very good at shaking her booty. And in fact, she is trying to change the world and improve, people's sense of being and their physical activity and so forth by what she calls, as it's translated, booty therapy. That's the sister of this guy who ended up, being killed in the events that related to the takeover of the kosher deli. So you have these weird combinations that are occurring as people are trying to escape the circumstances. And, the bulk of the people in these countries are people that are just trying to muddle through. They're just trying to figure out how to get a job or how to do something that will help them to put food on the table. That's the bulk of the people living in these very poor, depressed places. Some of them maybe are getting lucky, and they're making their name as famous rappers or famous hip-hop artists, right? And then alongside these same people coming out of these same depressed communities are people that are tuning into radical Islam, being radicalized by social media, and then going off to try to fight alongside ISIS in Syria and in Iraq, or perpetrate their own kind of heinous attacks on people in various and sundry other places around the planet. So I think that I'm looking at the clock. I will try to stay reasonably true to what I said. I think I'm pretty much finished, and I will see whether you have any questions for me about any of this. Thank you.
We're going to allow for questions. We have 2 microphones, so if you'll raise your hand, we'd like you to use the microphone so that everyone can hear your question. And I have a microphone, and Gail has one over there. So there's the first question over there. Gail, if you'll hand her the microphone, please.
What % of the problem is the way we are trying to assimilate people that come into these countries, whether it's France or the United States or wherever?
Well, I think that the effort has been extremely poor for the reasons that I was focusing on earlier on in the talk, in that as I'm a comparative political scientist. That means I try to teach people about the more the internal or domestic politics of, and how to think about analyzing the internal or domestic politics of any country on the planet. And if you want to look for sources of conflict, what produces conflict, because a lot of what political scientists spend time doing is trying to figure out what the source of conflict is in any particular place, then you can immediately turn to a checklist and ask whether there is conflict that is being produced along this particular so-called line of societal cleavage. So pardon me for my putting my professorial cap on here again and getting a little bit jargony and so forth. So what are those classic lines of societal cleavage? There are things like social class, language, right, religion, and then it's a good healthy list, but you can add to the list very, very easily yourself, the nature of education, occupations, and so on and so forth. But the major ones would be the gender, the ones that I've talked about beforehand. Now, anytime, anywhere, you have a reinforcement of these societal lines of cleavage so that you're laying one on top of the other, so that people are poor. People there have to be from the same religion, which is different from the people who are richer, let's say. People in that poor group of a different religion don't speak the language as well as, or don't speak the language like the people in the bulk of the population. Anytime you have an overlapping that's like this, as opposed to a cross-cutting of those cleavages, it's a recipe for disaster. So I always say to my students in my intro course, look at Canada. Have they had historically problems in Canada in terms of people getting along with one another? Historically, yes, right? Why? Well, because the people that live in the eastern part of the country, in Quebec, are people who speak French, right? And a lot of the people earlier on in Quebec also who were French-speaking tended to be poorer. Not all of them, of course, but they tended to be poorer than the people that were from the... And then what religion did the French practice? Catholicism, whereas the people who were, in the English-speaking part, far more of them were, Anglicans and from other Protestants. So there you go. Now, Canada has managed to get by reasonably okay. It hasn't blown up there. They've had their moments when it came close to being, but so if you go back to these circumstances in these other countries where you have that those reinforcing lines of society, so you have to try to figure out ways to break those down as best as you can, right? You can't be then taking the people from the get-go and saying like, okay, all of you are going to live there, right? And we're building these housing units for you, and you're going to be in those housing units. I didn't notice beforehand, or mention beforehand, by the way, that there's nothing in these banlieues. They don't have movie theaters to speak of. They don't have cultural centers. I went over this fast enough. You know, when the original units that they bought, 10% of them had toilets in them. It wasn't until the 1960s that 41% of those units had toilets in them, and it wasn't until 2001 that you had 96% of them that had toilets in them. So, you know, you're living in the, you know, I don't want to get too graphic in the language here, right? And so you're creating circumstances which are reinforcing the separateness and the otherness and the divisions and so forth, as opposed to doing whatever you possibly can to try to make it easier for people to integrate. Spending on education, obviously, you know, would be one area where there is greater focus and so forth now, but you know, but up until fairly recently, not much success.
Is there hope for
Not sure where the question's
improvement of
coming from.
life for these people, that they can stay in Syria, can stay in Turkey, can stay wherever they are? Is there a realistic hope of taking the pressure off these people? Syria is, it's not a theocracy. It's a country that allowed religious freedom.
Comparatively speaking, right? Not in any sort of ideal way, one could argue. The problem in the Syrian case is that you had the country being run from 1970 onward by the same family, and the same family comes from the Alawi subdivision of the Shiite branch of Islam, with a lot of you know, special provisions and assistance provided to people that are coming from more that community, from the Alawite community, than from other people. You did find Christians, actually, who in recent times were more supportive of the regime of the Assads, including Bashar al-Assad. Why? Because they didn't want to see the Islamists, and especially the radical Islamists, come to power in the Syrian case, because they thought that this would make things even way worse for them than the difficulties that they were experiencing in the earlier decades. So not exactly a wonderful place for people of minority religious backgrounds, unless you're Alawite, to be living in Syria. Each country has its own, you know, peculiar traits along those lines, which I could go into if people wanted me to. But so if you look at the situation there today, though, it's horrific. And so the people who, they're voting with their feet by the millions, right? And there's no easy relief in sight for that situation. I do think, and I kind of hope, that the Islamic State folks, of course, will be crushed. But it's not very easy for anyone to do that. So now you have how many major countries that are teaming up with one another to try to make that happen? And yet, you know, maybe out of fear that you don't want to create too much collateral damage when you're bombing people, maybe that's the way some people are looking at it. You know, that this is part of the explanation. Or there also is the fear that if we snuff these people out there, then somebody else in another name is just going to reappear, or maybe under the same banner of the Islamic State, it's going to appear in some other place. But the situation right now in Syria in particular is super grim, and so there's no easy fix there. It's something that will take, well, one would have to guess, you know, a fair amount of time. But it would begin in that particular case with trying to block the strength of the Islamic State. And I think people are doing a reasonably good job of checking it. It's certainly not expanding its influence in the way that it was for a fair amount of time.
A question right there.
I've got a question on Sharia law, and where the Taliban and ISIS control the lands. Sharia law is the law of the land.
Or a particular interpretation thereof.
Yes. About a month or so ago, I heard on the radio or on TV, I forget what it was, but anyway, a survey was taken of Muslims' attitude towards Sharia law in various countries. And one of the countries was the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very disturbing, the results of this survey, in that they found that the Muslims that are living in the United States, approximately 30% of them either approved wholeheartedly of Sharia law or to some degree accepted it if it happened to be coming their way.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was very disturbing, and I'd like your thoughts about that, about the Muslims in the United States and their attitude towards Sharia law. Thank you.
My thoughts about that are the following. Which interpretation of even Sharia law is one talking about, or are they talking about? Because, you know, one of the things I was trying to point out a moment ago is that these radical Islamists are not practicing Sharia law as it is understood by the bulk of the people of the Islamic faith. One quick example along those lines that pops into my head is what's happening with some of these women that they've been recruiting right out, and some of them are coming from Europe to be married off to the fighters. And so the fighters go off and they fight, and they get killed, or they disappear. But often it's because they're being killed. And so the leaders of this new radical Islamic community founded by ISIS are going to these women who have become widowed and telling them, okay, here's the next fighter we want you to marry. And for the ones who are knowledgeable enough, because a lot of them wouldn't be either probably, about the faith that they're practicing, they say things like, well, wait a minute, the 3-month waiting period hasn't passed yet. I have to wait, according to Sharia law, X number of months to make sure that I'm not carrying the baby of the person that I was married to beforehand. And so the new power holders are saying, like, oh, no, we don't want you to do that. No, you need to get married again right away, too, and we want you to marry Ahmed, right? And so, I think part of the problem with these surveys even then is, how are the people who are being asked the question, if they're American Muslims, how are they perceiving the question itself? And if they're thinking about their own more moderate interpretation of Sharia law, that means something completely different than if you were asking them whether or not they would endorse the Wahhabi interpretation of, the Saudi Arabia-based, let's say, interpretation of Sharia law, right? And so my problem in answering your question is with the question itself. Because who's asking the question? What are they thinking about when they're talking about Sharia law? And how is the question being perceived by a Muslim or any other person who's knowledgeable or not so knowledgeable about the faith? So there's not really an easy answer to that. I don't know if that's trying to skate by the question that you're. I'm not trying to skate by it. I'm trying to honestly answer the question. So do you have a follow-up maybe in terms of trying to pin me down on a specific thing? Because these are also people who are living here, and so they recognize that as a Muslim living in a foreign country, they need to be, and you have very high-level clerics, the highest level clerics imaginable in places like Egypt and elsewhere, which tell them that basically they have to live in harmony with the laws of the land where they're residing. And I think they would think that's all the more true if they're residing in a country like the United States. They might not think that that's true if they're residing in a, I don't know, I was going to guess communist country or something like that, North Korea or something maybe comes to my mind, but that's maybe a little bit far-fetched as an example.
I forgot to mention that one of my concerns about the result of that survey was that this 30% um, it seems that they have, they're compromising their attitude towards our Constitution, our laws, and our country. Because my opinion of Sharia law is that they one does not complement the other or vice versa. But I guess that's what my follow-up is. I forgot to mention that it was alarming to the degree that they don't respect the Constitution in the land that they're living. Because of this 30%, their more or less sympathetic attitude towards Sharia law, if in fact it was the law that they would be living under in the United States.
Right. I think I answered the question earlier on, and I guess the only other thing I would add to that is that if you are a devout Muslim, then Sharia law has two basic sources. One is the Quran itself, which is seen as the Word of God. But another basis for Sharia law is from the Hadith, the sayings, or the Ahadith in plural, the sayings and teachings of the Prophet Mohammed. And even there, then there's a lot of controversy and debate. There are different schools of thought and so forth. And so it's not as though everybody is on the same page. It's not as though Muslims themselves are on the same page in terms of which, Hadith are the ones that are relevant and to be abided by. All of this leaves then a margin of maneuver for Muslims in terms of their practice and in terms of their acceptance. And I think if you just tune in to a lot of the interesting discussions that are occurring recently in media in the United States, then what you'll hear Muslims themselves saying is that there really isn't a problem with their demonstrating complete agreement with the Constitution and abiding by the laws of the country. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about Saudi Arabia a little bit because I'm concerned you talked about soft power, and I see more and more like the last few years with Saudi Arabia that because of the oil wealth there and the extreme conservative attitudes that they have in that part of the world,
Right.
that like many people, they believe that the way they do things is the way that most people in the world should do them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm seeing with their invasions of Yemen, trying to destroy the energy industry in North Dakota. How many of the Syrian refugees has Saudi Arabia allowed to absorb into their country to welcome them as fellow Muslims? I'm very concerned about what's going on with Saudi Arabia right now. And I know that we seem to sit on our hands or feel like we can't criticize them because they sit on so much oil and they can really hurt us, our economy, if they want to. And so we have to bite our tongue. But I know a lot of people that are looking at Saudi Arabia and saying that is this going to be a long-term war over hundreds of years where their way of doing things is going to be continually fighting with the West?
Yeah, I mean, I personally agree with all of the points that you're making. And so to the extent that I've written about these things, because I haven't written about them that much, I didn't plug my book yet. I have said things quite comparable to what you are saying yourself, that there are a number of things that I think the U.S. government should change in the way it approaches all sorts of issues in the area. But one of them would have to do with our approach to the Saudis. Because in a way, well, not in a way, they're propagating an interpretation of the faith, which is the interpretation which is basically being endorsed by these radical Muslims. And in the sense, it's coming right back to bite them in the keister, isn't it? And so there's a bit of a disjuncture there that the Saudis themselves have to recognize. I'm inclined to hope that over the longer run, you'll have people of younger generations that hopefully will bring younger ideas that they have acquired either from inside their own country or that they've learned while they've been studying, you know, abroad and so forth, whether in the United States or somewhere in Western Europe, but many of them have studied here. And then they'll begin to try to figure out a way, because this is not going to be easy, to get the really ultra-conservative clerics out of business, and to have recourse to those clerical figures, people that understand Sharia law and Islamic law, and that are much more desirous of people practicing more moderate interpretations of the faith. So I think this goes back to the earlier question, because this is part of my response to the previous question, and I think that are there people out there who are propagating, disseminating really aggressive interpretations of the faith? Yes, they are, and I think in a lot of ways it begins with the Saudis themselves, and that we have to get real with them, and and maybe the present circumstances make that more propitious, because again, if you look at what's been discovered in the way of energy resources in this country in recent times, then we're not as much in the same situation as we were in earlier times. We've never been in a situation like many of the European countries have been in, but we're not in a situation like we were ourselves, even in terms of our dependence upon oil that's coming from that part of the world. Where do we get most of our oil from? Canada. And then number 2 is Venezuela. Number 3 is Nigeria, I think, something in this order. And then number 4 is Saudi Arabia. And so even in terms of the countries from which we import a lot of our oil, you have to go down to number 4 basically before you get to Saudi Arabia. And that's been true for quite some time. So I see a ray of hope, too, there, but it doesn't seem like one, as you're suggesting yourself, I agree with you completely again, that people have been playing upon, interestingly. Okay.
I heard the statistic that there are only 1% of Muslims in the United States religiously. And if that's true, and are they, what I was wondering, are they Sunnis or are they Shiite? And if they're Sunnis, would that explain the building of mosques from Saudi Arabia money, if indeed that's happening?
I think your percentage is a bit off. If I'm not mistaken, the size of the Muslim community in the United States, going back about 6 or 7 years ago, actually surpassed that of the Jewish community in the United States. It's interesting, isn't it? And of course, most of them are Sunnis. An important component of people in that community are people that are coming from African American backgrounds. Don't forget about that dimension to the spread of, but Islam has been, one of, if not maybe even the most rapidly expanding faiths in the United States as a result of just reproduction but immigration to a considerable degree as well. So yes, they would be primarily Sunnis. And you're making me think of a student that I just had this last fall her family's from Lebanon and she's from Shiite. And she covers herself. A lot of my Sunni students from the area are not, especially the ones that are from the area, are less inclined to cover themselves than the Sunni women who are from the United States at my college. Interesting little twists again, right? But she feels like she's the minority within the minority. She's really quite delightful and funny. This Shiite woman that I just met this past fall. And so, yeah, she's in this minority within a minority group.
We are out of time. It's 5:30. I want to thank all of you. For attending. I want to thank Dr. Beattie for sharing his insights. And he does have a book. So if you are interested in his recent book, you can come down and talk with him. But let's give him a round of applause as he talks.
Thank you.
We have also recorded today's, and so we will have it available. And there were some people who had told me they couldn't make it today, and they were wondering if we were recording today's presentation. So it will be recorded and probably will be out on the public access channel and maybe up on our YouTube channel, which is where I will have the presenters from last week's good ideas as well pretty soon. We have a question over here. And the name of the book.
Yeah, I've been spending a lot of my time over past years doing research for this book. Please, if you have to go, don't go, which is entitled Congress and the Shaping of the Middle East. And so what I did was I made several trips to Washington, D.C., and I would go up on the Hill. I would go into congressional offices, completely unannounced, have a good pile of cards in my breast pocket, walk up to the clerical staff near the door and present themselves and tell them I was doing a study on the role Congress plays in shaping Middle East affairs. And could I please speak with the staffer of the congressperson, of the senator and so forth, who is managing the portfolio, the foreign affairs portfolio for Senator so-and-so or for Congresswoman Q, right? And then I had many, many interviews, so I interviewed about 130 House staffers, went into probably about 300 offices altogether. And I went into all 100 Senate offices and was able, in the time limitations that I had, and some people won't cooperate, Quick story about that just momentarily for people who want to stay here just a couple seconds longer. And I had interviews with over 30 Senate staffers. And I had ways of cross-checking this to make sure that I had a pretty good sample, on both sides. So it worked out well. So this is full of quotes from staffers about how they see the game being played. And I start by looking at even elections and the role that money plays in elections. The thought that popped into my head a moment ago about that you might all find interesting, it's not surprising, even the senators from Wisconsin were quite gracious, and so I got invited in to speak with the foreign policy people in the senators' offices. It was Cole in the earlier time, but also in Feingold's office. And the specific thought that I had is I walked into Senator Feingold's office, and that was the only office in which I encountered a woman who was covered. Right? So here's a Jewish American senator, and in his office he has a woman who is muhaggaba. I thought, how cool.
Again, thank you very much.